Stay right there. What are you waiting for? Kill him! Kill them both! No, wait a minute. Is it money you're after? I'll give you as much as you want.
May the saints forgive you, because I won't.
Okay, Neon Tiger, my longtime Dharma brother. I just called you the Dharma dad, so I'm not going to shy away from that on recording. But can you give us like some background on who you are, what your practice looks like your relationship with Dharma, as much or as little as you want, and sort of your current, like, what is your current, like, working, we'll use a really chaos magic term, what is your current working paradigm, or like day-to-day daily Dharma look like?
Yeah, good.
And thanks so much for coming on. I apologize for not but thank you so much for coming on. I really appreciate it. We've been trying to set this up for like 2 years, so yeah. I legit am grateful.
Oh, I'm super excited to be here, and it's been great. I mean, I've always loved our conversations, both in group chats and one-to-one, so really honored and happy to be a part of it. So my Dharma background, I mean, forgive me, I'll be a little bit generalizing, but for the most part, I'll just walk through it. So when I was about 16, I started studying under a pretty well-known Zen master, and pretty seriously up until the time I was about 19 or 20, at which point, and at the same time I was doing sort of a combination of Raja Yoga pretty seriously under a teacher there, mostly the energetic stuff. So it was quite a westernized version of it, where I was living. And then I was also practicing some of the Taoist esoteric techniques, the Taoist alchemy, the Mantak Chia type of stuff. And so through that, I came to be a little bit, I won't say disenchanted, but I'll say I was more interested in the energetic and the philosophical elements of the Tibetan side of things. And I was able to find a teacher pretty early on, when I was 22. And that was after so I spent an extended time in Nepal. And so doing the pilgrimage and all of that. And so I found a teacher, mostly Nyingma, but distinctly Rime, but with like a Nyingma bent. And so I studied with him for quite some time, and then had another, and he was sort of a jet set Lama. And then had another teacher, very close teacher, that was local to where I was. And so he became one of my main teachers. And then from there, I just continued to study and practice. My master's and my doctoral level work is in Tibetan Buddhism, even though I don't actively really teach in an academic capacity or even in a Dharma capacity. I do have the embarrassment of one of my teachers requested me to teach and gave some official blessings around teaching and all of that. But I choose not to teach really in a very direct way, unless I'm really, really requested for a very specific element, just because I think there's so many good teachers out there, good professional teachers. And then that was, 27 years ago, something like that. And I still am practicing to this day, mostly Rime. So Nyingma, a bit of Jonangpa lately with Khenpo Rinpoche. He's very actively teaching quite a bit the Kalacakra lineage, quite a bit of Kagyu as well. And then, not so much Gelugpa, but definitely I have some empowerments and teachings around that too.
Well, you already know this, but we're going to get along great because obviously you said all the kind of standpoints that I also explore. Maybe not so much Kalacakra, but you know, I'm much more interested in sort of like decentralized quote unquote Dharma.
Yeah.
Like from that kind of Rime. I wouldn't consider myself Nyingma. My initial empowerments were Sakyapa. Obviously, I received a public Kalacakra initiation when I was like a little kid, not a little kid, but you know, like pretty young. And that I would say that those are the most formative things for me now. So I wonder for you, is it the same? Like, have you come closer to your original sort of ideas of Dharma, or have you like practically or even philosophically, or have you sort of like you know, change your mandala, change your sort of like positionality, your view of it?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think if you're doing Dharma practice right enough, because ultimately we're not really doing Dharma practice right until we're enlightened, and at which point we no longer have a need for practice. So it's always just a learning curve in terms of what you're actually doing. But I think if you're doing it consistently and you're doing it under the guidance of a teacher and you're doing it sincerely, you're bound to have a closer experience to Dharma than you would have when you started. And so that, I would say that definitely is echoed in my experience of things. And I tend to be, it's interesting, Jen. In my worldview, just I will also call it even my personality, I have a tendency toward field stripping, meaning getting to the essential of things. Like I'm less interested in, I mean, even to this day, like I'm terrible at ritual, right? Like actual ritual, like I'll follow a long sadhana and all that, but really I'm going to take the much more Dzogchen approach to the sadhana, which is like an instantaneous type of visualization and all of that. And I think that plays out really in just my day-to-day life. So I'm very much oriented toward what's essential and hitting those points. And then of course, like Dzogchen Mahamudra is more oriented toward that than I think the longer ritualized sadhana type of work. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm glad you clarified this, because I feel now I kind of feel ganged up on like I'm the sole Mahayoga practitioner, and I'm not really.
No.
Not
at all.
Like
so
this episode is going to be a three-way Mexican standoff in terms of like, you know, Dharma backgrounds here. That's fine. We can accept that.
Totally. It's funny. I can't remember where it was. There's some practice or some book I read that some famous Nyingma Lama was like, you can't call yourself a Nyingmapa unless you can like at least demonstrate some Mahayoga, some like ritual expertise, at least in terms of like the outcome. So I certainly will dabble in what it would, I think, considered from the outside, like the magical side of things as well.
Absolutely. And, you know, like Dzogchen as Tantras from a Rime approach, you know, that Dzogchen is equivalent to Mahayoga, especially when we're talking about Vajrasattva Tantras and like the non-dual Anuttara Yoga Tantras. It's all considered the same thing. So for me, but I appreciate that, like, I know Solar is also like this, like the very process oriented, like results oriented, more precision, sort of like getting to the state of consciousness. I guess this is where like my quote unquote ADHD and like Dharma collide, is that I need the focal point of the deity to get there.
Yeah.
I just know that about myself. And so it's the most practical, results oriented sort of practice for me. It's not necessarily doing activity, but absolutely. Activity is part of Mahayoga. So
yeah. Well, the view, so this is a really interesting and nuanced concept. So the view of Dzogchen is the same view as the completion stage without signs within Mahayoga. So the view is the same, right? And just from a Dzogchen perspective, if we take Dzogchen as, so you take it as, you know, view, path, or result. And if we take it as the path, and it's like, yeah, okay, there are specific actual techniques or practices that are considered Dzogchen only, like Cheksho, Togol, all that stuff. And at the same time, you can do any Mahayoga sadhana through a Dzogchen view, which is simply just like, can you rest in the nature of mind in the beginning? That's like it, right? So like, even if you look at the Nyingma corpus, all the sadhanas that are considered Dzogchen just start with resting in the nature of mind. But if you look at then the Mahayoga stuff, how they do it is, or how we would do that at that level, is you say the mantra, right? So you say a mantra and then everything collapses into the nature of mind. And that's the same view as Dzogchen. So it really just depends on, have you been introduced to the nature of mind? Do you have confidence in the nature of mind? If you do, then it's possible to practice anything with a Dzogchen type of flavor to it, right? Even though you're not necessarily doing Togel or Treksho within it.
I've always found the particular insistence that because I think the distinction from like a purist standpoint would simply be that from the Dzogchen side of it, it's like, well, none of the nature of mind is already there, right? The sort of like open awareness is already there. It's not something that's produced by going through these kind of like steps, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, at that point, that's a completely pedantic point and largely irrelevant, right? Like in terms of like practice, especially it's like, okay, well, if you're ending up there, you have that in mind, like the entire time as the target. There's no like theoretical disagreement in terms of like, well, yes, it's already there. We're just sort of functionally producing it through these steps. I don't know.
Yeah, so functionally, it's a bit more in depth, but from a view standpoint, from a philosophical standpoint, there's absolutely no creation of it. Like you don't create the emptiness from a Mahayoga standpoint. You're not creating the experience of the nature of mind. Or everything is emptiness from the mantra itself, right? And that the commentaries are very clear about that. So philosophically, yes, I think there's zero disagreement, and I would even think that functionally, it's just a tool. It's exactly. I mean, when Jin talks about like, well, I need the deity to get to that space, that's exactly the purpose. That's the summarization of the purpose and the efficacy and the beauty of why we use deities. And it's such an interesting phenomenon among the Western Buddhist culture. There's this notion, especially among people that are fairly new, they're like, oh, I want the final, the real deal. I don't want to waste time on all these mantras and all of that. And it's like, well, can you rest in the nature of mind immediately? And probably not, right? And if not, then welcome to deity practice. And it's not like it's a second, you're not in the second place prize. It's actually the path to get there. And if you can't do that, then there's all kinds of other methodologies. I mean, I would make the argument that everything from the energy yogas to the physical yogas to just breath work, anything at all, it's upaya to get to the nature of mind. And then once you can understand or experience the taste of the nature of mind, that becomes the entirety of the practice.
That was extremely well said. Thank you so much for elucidating on that. I think also it ties right into my next question, which is about Kalacakra. So I think this is really interesting because this is obviously something that a lot of Western practitioners are interested in. There's perhaps tens of thousands of people that privately practice in whatever way. I don't know about their methodologies or their lineages or anything like that. I'm not the Dharma police, but I know that there are tens of thousands of private Kalacakra practitioners, both on the internet and off. And so this is one thing I find very interesting, particularly for me, about the Kalacakra mandala, is that the way I did not receive like a Jonangpa sort of empowerment or like the activity deity. I don't even think the Gelugpas give the Vajravega empowerment. Don't quote me on that, but that's how I understand. And so you don't necessarily need a deity per se to do like mind palace activities for Kalacakra because of the way it's so explicitly and complicated, like very complicated and complex in its sort of layout of the mandala. And it's so radically different also than a lot of the other Anantara Yoga texts. So I just wanted to say ask if you have any like sort of, what is your view of Kalacakra and how do you understand it in relation to like a Western Dharma practitioner, and how a lot of them, whose sincerity I don't know, so I can't comment on it, but you could say that a lot of people who are more interested in quote unquote real Tantra or getting to the real results of Tantra, magical maybe, they're very interested also in Kalacakra.
You guys just really like to jump into the deep end, don't you?
Yes, sir.
We're like 13 minutes in. Let's discuss the essence and nature of Kalacakra. First, around practitioners, and this is, my views have evolved around this. I used to be not the Dharma police exactly, but very much a stickler for lineage and all of that. And I still definitely fall into that camp, in that category, but I've loosened up a bit because I think Kalacakra in particular has a unique karmic cement with humans. At least this is as it's told within the tradition, within people as they actually practice it. And so the idea that people can practice it and it's somewhat open as a highest yoga tantra, even though these days in Tibet, I mean, you can go, there's nobody stopping you from getting the highest teaching pretty much from anybody at any time. And oftentimes, like, you can get empowerments online and all of that stuff. So it's a bit more open. I think that goes to the prophecies of, tantras coming to the forefront in this age. But Kalacakra in particular has a somewhat unique property of really being able to drive people's experience. And then ideally in the tradition, talking about, where you're born next. So whether you're born in Shambhala or here when the advent of Shambhala comes, which is essentially like a golden age type of prophecy. So I would encourage people, even if they're not very strong in their practice, even just with some faith, and if they've got the empowerment, they can say the mantra, or even if not, you can visualize, you can do a front visualization of Kalacakra or the mandala to the best of your ability, or your teacher or something like that, and just make the wish to be reborn in Shambhala or to get these teachings. So I would say there's great benefit in that. So I would want to encourage anybody that feels, if their hair stands up on it, if they get the tingles around Kalacakra, then sit down and do some meditation to the best of your ability, imagining the deity in front of you, or however you want to think about that. And if you have empowerment, you can say the mantra and do that. That's very good level. And you'd be surprised, I think, even in Asia, that's the level of most people's practice, right? Most of the time they're doing some kind of front visualization. They have a good feeling, a feeling of faith, maybe a feeling of joy that comes along with it. And you can go very, very far with that. So I definitely encourage people to do that as much as possible. Now, that being said, Kalacakra is interesting, especially because it also really revealed the tantric path in a way that is very complete. Kalacakra supremacists like Khenpo Rinpoche, who is one of my teachers, and I say that very lovingly, he'll tell you, it's by far the best for lots of different reasons. But if you look at tantras and tantra commentary, like, all of them are saying they're the best all the time, right? Like I literally will chant different prayers that'll say, like, this is the one, like, it encapsulates all others, and then the next one will be like, this is the fastest, it encapsulates all others. So that's a common trope. Not to diminish it at all. Like, Kalacakra is quite complete and incredibly powerful. So the unique part about Kalacakra is that the yogas, the six Vajra yogas, are a little bit different than other traditional yogas. So the 6 yogas of Naropa, right, which is very common, dealing mostly with energy. With the 6 Vajra yogas, actually starts with a form of Vajra. What's the word I'm looking for? Of dark retreat. And so they enter in at a pretty high level with dark retreat. And Jonangpas in particular, like, they actually identified the Maha Yoga, so like the creation stage, as essentially like the preliminary. So many Jonangpas, that was the preliminary practice, was the creation stage of Kalacakra, and then they jumped right into the 6 Vajra yogas of Kalacakra. Not to say that they skipped any parts, like they still do it, but even now, like Khenpo Rinpoche, the main exponent, I would say, of Jonangpa Kalacakra in this time, he'll say that as well. Have some familiarity, get some stability with it, but let's get into the juicy bits, which I think appeals to a lot of Westerners because it is quite direct. Now, whether or not they can do 30 days in dark retreat is a different matter, right? It does. Regardless of how well prepared you think you are, dark retreat will reveal that. So
thank you for fielding that. I do appreciate it. I know Kalacakra is extremely complex.
I just had a quick follow-up that I wanted to get on to that, because I'm really curious about the idea of dark retreat. So I'm only familiar with it in 2 contexts. So the main context is in that of Togyal for Dzogchen, right? And you are already, in most cases, like in a sort of normative path for that, you're already like in an advanced stage of Togyal when your lama is going to tap you and say you're ready for the 49 days. In my tradition, it's usually 7 by 7, right? So that exists. Yeah, I mean, it's not quite the end of the path, obviously, but you're already into like stage first two of the four, right, of Togyal as we break it down. And the other context of dark retreat that I'm familiar with, the other Dharma gate would be the sort of ordeal of the abyss, you know, in the sort of Order of Nine Angles Western esoteric path, which I mentioned half as a joke. But the point is that even in a sort of like Western esoteric context, you know, left-hand path context, the ordeal of the dark retreat, which in that instance is a month usually, it's undertaken by like a master and mistress of earth. It's sort of framed as this sort of cumulative, like significant near terminal step in the sort of development of the path, right? And so I'm really curious, is this common in other sort of traditions, specifically within Vajrayana, to begin with the dark retreat? And is it conceptualized differently, or are they also conceiving of it as this kind of near terminal thing? They're just doing it. I don't know. Yeah. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. So a couple of things. One, I have zero capability or qualifications to talk about the Western side of things, but that's interesting and fascinating. So I'd love to learn more about that. But within Dzogchen, it's important to think that there are many cycles, right? So there are many cycles. So and I'm not saying that you don't understand this. I just want to clarify for anybody that's listening. So there are multiple, typically nintig, which means like heart essence, and it just means the pithiest, the most direct kind of path. And this is all within Nyingma for the most part, although Kagyu does have some exposure to this. There is no set, there's a variation when it comes to what is considered like the standard approach. And so sometimes, very much depending on the teacher, very much depending on the cycle, you might have more access to a dark retreat or maybe none at all, right? So it just depends. So it's very much, there are a lot of variables that go into it. But typically, within a Nyingma sort of idea, is the first is Treksha, which is essentially like resting in the nature of mind. So you get pretty good at resting in the nature of mind, some stability, to greater or lesser degree, depending on your teacher. And then from there, you go into Togel, which is like essentially working with light appearances, and the idea that those appearances are empty, and then these cool visions start to show up, or maybe not so cool visions start to show up, all of that. And then you further that and deepen that through dark retreat. And that's sort of it is, I would say that's pretty close to the terminal destination, if we want to use that terminology within the Nyingma formulation. But along the way, that's all just taking the Dzogchen type of path. Along the way within Nyingma, you're going to have exposure to and possibly practice, or maybe you don't emphasize it so much, all of the more energetic yogas. So like Tumo, illusory body, dream yoga, those kind of traditional ones. And that fits with the path of kind of Taplam, which is like the path of methods that you see pretty commonly even in the Sarma tradition. Now, where in Kalacakra they step in, they say that stabilizing the appearances as illusion is sort of the first spot where you get isolation of Dharma and Dharmata, meaning like what is phenomena, what counts as phenomena versus what is the suchness of reality, which is how you could translate Dharmata. We could just call it like manifest Buddha nature in that way. So they take that as an entry point, and then they later do what are considered these more more energetic focused yogas, so like Tumo and things like that. And so it's a jumping off point, but it's also there's a question about the order of things. And from what I can tell, I mean, they both work, right? Like they're enlightened practitioners from Dzogchen tradition, from Mahamudra, and from Kalacakra, of course. And what I want to say one more thing, going to Jin's point, every single tantra in highest yoga tantra, so that's what we're talking about, right? Anantara yoga tantra, they have what you're talking about as the activities, the 4 or 5 activities. So enrichment, pacification, magnetizing, all of that. Some of them emphasize certain ones more. Some of them, it's more of a hidden kind of discussion. Like if you go to a Kula Tantra, obviously it's going to be all about magnetizing, but there are also rites that have to do with enrichment, for instance, and vice versa. So every single Tantra has all of that included within it, has all the activities. It's not like you have to necessarily go to one or the other. Now, in practice in Tibet, though, it does seem to be like if you want it fast, if you're trying to magnetize something, meaning to manifest or to like bring things to you, Kurukula is the obvious choice because it's so fast with that. So it's like there's kind of the proximal action of each deity, but each deity or each practice, each tantra has every level of activity within it.
I feel a bit called out, I'm not gonna lie. Simply obviously because I like that Dakini. But in clarification of that, I did practice Havajra. That was my first highest yoga tantra that I ever practiced. So even though I like Kurukula to a high degree, I like that activity form. Secretly, I've always looked at it and I see Nyingma. I'm just being honest. I never thought of it as an activity, specifically an activity practice in that way. I know it was, and even when I would practice it, I knew it was. But there was something, it was more for knowledge states. It wasn't, I never used it for magnetizing, but I understand that at the activity level, that is what it means.
Yeah. Well, I would push even a bit further and say, if you have a connection to a particular deity, eventually all deities are not metaphorically, but in actuality, just a manifestation of that deity. And in Nyingma, the most common expression of this is they'll say everything is Guru Rinpoche, right? Everything is Guru Rinpoche. Every deity, and even all the deities that are not on this planet, are like a manifestation of Guru Rinpoche, because that's the central, within the Nyingma formulation. But if you take Vajra or Kalacakra, it's like there's no separation at the essential level between Kurukula, Vajra, and you. And that's the insight that we're getting to, not in a theoretical way, but in an actual palpable way. So I would push it even farther and say, you can and should use whichever deity feels most connected to you, and also recognize that they're all manifestations of the one.
Absolutely. I mean, of course I agree with that. It is interesting because I have recently sort of changed the mandala that I am practicing and the root text that I practice. And this one feels right to me. I know that sounds like so new age Dharma, but it felt right. It felt like nothing it was the same. Like I felt I could recognize all the same things in the text, but I couldn't, it clicked a lot easier. I was like, okay, this actually makes sense. This is like the color theory, the way the deities arise. It's a wrathful Vajrasattva text. It's equivalent to Kalacakra in some ways, some Sarma school ways of thinking about it. It can be obviously considered in that way, in a Lamdre way, where you're supposed to teach people obviously this, but you teach people the non-dual ideas, and it's sort of at the exoteric level, but there may be seeds in them, so then other people can sort of take of it, and depending on the deepening of your practice, maybe those seeds will rest in abiding for a decade or so, but eventually perhaps one will sprout. So, and then obviously Lamdre has I won't want to say gradients, but obviously the oral instruction is important, and then the secret instruction, which I never received. So most of my perceptions were always from her oral instruction. So I was always I would say I was always familiar with the inner level theoretically. And so I always I thought that was more of the quote unquote real layer, which of course it is in a way. So I'm definitely being more conservative is what I'm saying when speaking to you, Tiger. It's not, but so I agree and appreciate that you're sort of pushing into this more like, yeah, it's a non-dual view. You should, all the deities are really whatever mandala deity is the central focus, or the refuge tree deity.
Yeah,
so,
exactly.
Absolutely.
Or whichever one. And there's, to your point, there's a great deal of individual connection that goes along with that. And that's where, typically oftentimes a teacher will assign you. He'll say like, I want you to practice, let's say you say 100,000 mantras, or do a significant portion. I'm speaking within like the Nyingma tradition. Do a whole bunch with Vajrakalaya, and then I want you to go practice Hayagriva, because that's probably going to be your main deity, and you're going to get like faster results. So teachers will say that even when you're getting certain empowerments, like you put a tooth stick. I don't know if you've done that in certain traditions. You'll have a tooth stick, which is basically just an old-fashioned toothbrush, and then you put it in the middle of a mandala, and then it'll fall into one of the 8 deities, or one of the 5 families, or whatever it is. And so you'll practice deities along that family. So if you're in the Padma family, which is red, Amitabha, you're going to have more results around Kurukula, around Amitabha, around Amitayus, those red deities that have to do with power and magnetizing. And so you can, the intuitive version of this is just like, which deity are you drawn to? Which deity are you most interested in? I mean, I know somebody, from group chats and stuff, was very interested in Vajrasattva, and that he is pursuing that, and I believe successfully practicing currently. So listen to your intuition, and everybody has different connections with different deities. That's the whole point as to why there are different deities, right? It's not just about the action. It's about different people need different vitamins in order to be healthy.
No, that's an incredible point about the Dharmakaya, like the Dharma mind in relationship to the deity. I'm so glad you said that. Like, to hear you say that sort of reifies a lot of what I think about and how I sort of appraise the mandala. Yes, we did do that. I think I did it as I must have been in my early 20s. And I did, and it fell on Hayagriva, like Padma family. And I was always like, I'm always been a big Hayagriva. I've been very honest about that on the show, at least, is like, that is one of the practice that I like, one of the first deity practices that I ever really, really got into. Obviously Kurukula as well, but that, as I said, had different meaning for me. But yeah, absolutely. I think it's interesting that maybe the nature of Dharma mind can actually shift, just like people shift deities or shift mandalas as they sort of ripen or encounter obstacles on the path. And you're totally right to say that it's not about the activity. I agree with that very strongly, or identify with that. Yeah. It's not really about the activity. It's really about the karmic connection with the deity.
Yeah, exactly. And if you look at the hagiographies of these great masters, even up until, if you take like Mipham Rinpoche or anybody within any tradition, typically they'll master one or two or three or whatever their tradition is, but they continue to then go and do these practices up in the mountains. I'm going to go do a medicine Buddha practice now, or I'm going to, possibly about the activity, but also just to make sure that they have karmic connection moving forward. Like, it's the idea of, I want to have as karmic connection to the Dharma doors as much as possible. And so I'm going to continue to practice. And I'm assuming, presumably, they all had stability in the nature of mind where they could just sit around and do Treksho and Togo all day, right? But they still continue to do this as a way of deepening that connection.
Okay, so you opened up the gateway, we could say maybe the north gate of the mandala, for this question. So it's a Kalacakra question, but it's specific. It's there's obviously the three different commentaries that are popularized in English translation, the Taranatha, which identifies Kalacakra as it's sort of like a Vajradhara / cosmic Buddha. We can say that. Ju Mipham Rinpoche, he's very clear on it. In his commentary, he says Kalacakra is Vajrasattva. That's his appraisal. And then obviously there's an oral tradition, which I know Namkhai Norbu has discussed in some of his books, where he says that the way that they were instructed in Tibet was that it is a cosmic Shakyamuni specifically. And so I understand how this works in terms of like, there's different layers of reality presented to different publics and different audiences. But how can you reconcile that? I guess it's a really hard question. I'm sorry, but
no, that's such an awesome question. That's such an awesome question. This is going to appeal to like an audience of 2 out there, but I love it. I love this kind of stuff. So to answer that properly, let's define some terms, right? So and I'm mostly going to use a Nyingma understanding of terms, but you're going to see how this bleeds over to answer your question and to have I think a broader understanding of non-Nyingma traditions as well in terms of cosmology and the bodies of the Buddha. So in general, there's 3 bodies of the Buddha, right? Nirmanakaya, and then Sambhogakaya, and then Dharmakaya. Dharmakaya represents, essentially, if we had to think about it, it's like body, speech, and mind, or body, energy, and mind of the Buddha. And Dharmakaya is like the mind of the Buddha. And within Nyingma, typical Dharmakaya is Samantabhadra, right? The all good, it's Kuntu Zangpo. And typically he's naked and he's with a white woman around him, like sitting in consort posture. And that is considered like typical traditional kind of Dharmakaya Buddha within Nyingma tradition. Now, let's go to certain mandalas, right? So like right now I have a tanka of, it's not a mandala, but it's a giant tanka of Padmasambhava, Guru Rinpoche, the founder of Tibetan Buddhism, essentially Tantra Buddhism. And above him is Avalokiteshvara, which is so he himself is Nirmanakaya. So you get physical, typically it's like physical forms, right? Sambhogakaya above him is Avalokiteshvara. And then the Dharmakaya above Avalokiteshvara, the Buddha of compassion, or Bodhisattva of compassion, is Amitabha. So in that formulation, in that mandala, Amitabha represents Dharmakaya. It doesn't really make sense from like either a cosmological or iconographical piece to put like Samantrabhadra above Amitabha. I mean, you can, it kind of does happen, but it's like saying the essence of the essence, like, yeah, okay, kind of. But really, like Amitabha is that essence, right? Amitabha represents that Dharmakaya. And so your question is like, okay, we've got 3 different commentaries. We got Taranata, we have Namkha Nyingma Rinpoche, and then Mipham Rinpoche. Those 3 are saying 3 different things. Like one, I'm guessing Taranata is probably going to say Vajradhara, and who is a blue Buddha, and the blue Buddha is wearing essentially crowns and jewels in like the Indian royal fashion. And then you have who's the other one? Now I'm losing it. It's Taranata. Mipham Rinpoche is going to say Vajrasattva, and he's going to be a white Buddha in the form of also Indian tradition, with or without a consort, right? So he's going to have a whole bunch of stuff like jewels and stuff on him. And then you have Namkha Nyingma Rinpoche, who's like, no, it's the Dharmakaya of Shakyamuni, right? Who would look like a monk. So in each of those, they're all pointing to different ways of representing the same Dharmakaya that is within that tradition itself. And it doesn't mean there's disagreement in the slightest bit, because so like from a Nyingma perspective, Vajradhara is actually represented as like the Sambhogakaya of the Dharmakaya. So the Dharmakaya itself is going to have Nirmanakaya, Sambhogakaya, Dharmakaya, right? So like the Dharmakaya of the Dharmakaya, this is from Nyingma, is Samantabhadra, and he's naked, he just is there, pure, all of that. The Sambhogakaya of the Dharmakaya is Vajradhara, so with more ornaments and all of that. And then the Nirmanakaya would be whatever it is, like Garab Dorje or something like that. So each one of those is pointing to a Dharmakaya emblem within its own tradition. And even within Nyingma, like it's very common to have Vajrasattva as like what we call the Adi Buddha, like the original Buddha, meaning the Dharmakaya itself. Like for all intents and purposes, you can think of it like God. That's a little bit sloppy, but that's sort of what it's like, the fundamental fabric of reality.
Let me just interrupt you, Tiger. Like
Yeah.
I don't know if you know this, but my dad's Chinese Indonesian, and so when Indonesia did the Pancasila, like the 5 root race and the 5 religion reforms in the late 1940s, they actually had many Nyingma lamas come and sort of do this theosophical syncretism where they sort of related Adi Buddha to God. So I agree with you. That's not one-to-one, but there is something sort of that you can use, like there's a framework there that you can use to describe something similar, and just culturally I'm familiar with how that's done. So I just wanted to affirm that that's not wrong.
Thank you. Yeah, one of my teachers always talks about like if it's path language versus if it's found like view language. If it's view language, we can get into like very specific sort of philosophical discussions. But if it's path language, it's like, yeah, that's kind of like God, right? And everything. And because the idea is like we're just getting to the feeling of it. And so we can be a little bit more loose around some of the terms. But to go back to your question, all 3 of those are just pointing to, in that context, what counts as Dharmakaya. And so you'll see even within tantras, right? Like I'm doing a practice right now. I won't state what it is, but the Dharmakaya is Amoga Siddhi, right? So he is considered the Dharmakaya of that. And you could show there are ways to show Amoga Siddhi with no ornaments at all, where he just looks like a regular monastic Buddha, or there are ways to show him with like lots of different jewels and all of that. So all 3 of those are basically saying the same thing, whether it's Vajrasattva, Vajradhara, or the Dharmakaya of Shakyamuni.
Resolution of the 3-body problem. Thank you so much. That was I know that was a tough one, but you did a great job.
Oh no, I'm a big fan. I taught iconography a long time ago, and I think you can really understand so much about the path through exploring iconography and then reconciling these things that are just like, what the heck is going on here? Because there's such an embarrassment of riches when it comes to these images.
Absolutely. And I have a lesser art history background than you do. Like I didn't go all the way, but no, I mean that's my background in Buddhism too, is definitely tantric iconography. More Southeast Asian, like looking at Vajra obviously, and in the Khmer and Indian sort of positionalities and statuary and all that. But yeah. So I 100% agree with you. I think the whole path is there. I think the deities are the mandala, and I think that they explain to a degree to people who are maybe not on the first part of the marga, but maybe not super deep in either, but they can explain a lot of subtleties in practice and sort of and also ways of thinking, like the view. It can teach you that.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. I think it's true. I will say, I mean, if we want to go into the iconography piece, I love the Vajra stuff coming out of Southeast Asia. It's like I'm such a little kid when it comes to that. I have no real understanding of it. I'm just like in awe every time I run into like a Khmer Vajra or something. It's like so cool to see the translation into other cultures. And typically the more kingly, the more royal the appearance of the deity, specifically around the Dharmakaya, the later the transmission. Right. So early on, that's why in Nyingma, it's like very early, no ornamentation, all of that, because it's representing the naked state.
No, this makes complete sense to me as someone who's like a amateur tantric scholar. Like you have the Tara tantras from the 7th and 8th century, and she's depicted very much as a victorious one with her jewels, as like a queen or a princess, and it obviously translates and went through Burma, went through Cambodia, as we said, wasn't called Cambodia, or in Laos and Thailand and Indonesia as well. Indonesia had a large range of far-ranging tantric sort of complex that was syncretic with both obviously Indianized Bhairava Mahakala tantras as well as Vajra tantra. So I mean, there's a point when the kingly iconography becomes like sort of I think the royal families, at least in the Indonesian context, I think they are highly identified with this idea that, yeah, you actually could be like I don't want to use like the EA co-wedding old form, but it is kind of like become a living god in a way. And they saw themselves in the Vajradhara, which I'm not saying is totally wrong, but maybe not also quite right. But yeah, absolutely. And I think that this makes sense in terms of like how it was transmission, like the transmission lineage. It was definitely through these like royal families and also the sort of courtly advisors, rather than being a mass public religion, which was much more Indianized, much more of quote unquote Hinduism, whatever that even is. And yeah, so I just want to say I agree with you.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. It's interesting. It definitely at different times appealed to the royalty and the aristocratic sensibilities around, we can become more noble and still enjoy the world and all of that, and still be on a path of attainment. It's rich and complex. I mean, there's just so much to offer. If you look at Tantra as it's practiced in Tibet, for instance, it's like most people in Tibet are practicing from a Pure Land kind of perspective. They're saying Om Mani Padme Hum. They have a lot of faith, and they hope to like get to some kind of afterlife or some better future life. Could be this life too. That's positive, and that's totally fine. So there's like a real richness. And then if there's people, that are strangely inclined that want to practice magic, right? And they're like, they have an inkling toward the otherworldly and all of that. So I think we all fit. I think everybody in this talk fits into that. And then of course you have people that are just strictly, want to do kind of the mysticism element of it without necessarily that ritual aspect. So there's so much. There are very few. I don't know of any other tradition that has so many entry points and so many entire paths to focus on all the way to completion.
No, absolutely. There's it's a completion stage. It's a path of the completion stage, you could say. It's a path of cultivation. I often think of this in terms of like Dharma, but also like in literary terms for Zhanghu and Wuxia literature. There's a difference even, and it's even called something else, cultivation literature versus actual like heroic literature. So I often think of like the Pure Land, and this will obviously inform my next question, which I had already planned to ask you, but you know, there is elements of Pure Land Buddhism that can be really useful for a tantric practitioner of Vajrayana, because you can actually use those kinds of, I don't want to call them dark night of the soul or chapel perilous or whatever, but it is something like that, where you are shaken and you kind of are not, you feel like you've sort of gone off path. And maybe you don't have the directness of your teacher to be to reference for like guidance in this instance. But you can actually just take refuge again, like almost like as a newbie, you can take refuge again in, like, let's just say Amitabha, since that's obviously the most popular of the Dhyani Buddhas in terms of Pure Land, and you can sort of reorient yourself to that positionless positionality.
Yeah, I mean, it's very interesting from a practitioner's viewpoint. What is mantra really? Mantra is just the sound of the actual deity that you're trying to connect to. Like literally the actual, it is deity in sound form, not metaphorically, not meaningfully, like actually the sound of it. So when you're saying the mantra, it is connecting you with the deity. And so if you can say it earnestly and say it in a way that it really does ring that Buddha nature within you like a bell, then of course you're relying on the power of the Buddhas, which is very I would say that's completely in line with modern kind of Pure Land sensibilities. It's like, it's not really of your own power, it's of the Buddha's power. Now, from a philosophical standpoint, you know, this is where Tantra gets into it. It's like, well, one of my teachers used to say, you is it. Meaning like, yeah, okay, you're relying on the other power, but the seemingly otherness of it being the deity, is only an illusion. And ultimately you're going to get to, you are it, meaning the nature of mind is the same, whether it's in you or in the deity. And so I would say Tantra takes it a bit further. And I don't think that's in disagreement to the Pure Land. And I'm not a Pure Land scholar, so forgive me, all the Pure Land scholars that are out there. I'm sure I'm mangling this, but ultimately the idea is not necessarily just to get to the Pure Land, but to, to experience the nature of mind within yourself. That would be like the highest level. But to your point, you know, when you're laying on the floor in tears or something is like really going on, all you've got is faith. Like that's a very strong and powerful thing to move forward.
Thank you so much for saying that. That's the point I was trying to make, is that faith can be a very useful tool, but it has to also come from a place of like sincerity, bodhicitta, et cetera, et cetera. Mm-hmm. But yes, absolutely. It can be very powerful. And so, yeah, you sort of touched on it. This nature of mantra is really the root essence of all Tantra, as you said. But this is also textually stated in all higher yoga Tantras. And not just higher yoga Tantras, like all the way down the line.
Yeah, all the way down the line.
Yeah, I'm the guy for the basic questions. That's why they keep me in the child seat in the back. So I wanted to ask you a little bit more about faith, because I feel like this is an aspect of the overall sort of like, not just the cultural context of Buddhism, but it's an aspect of the practice that I feel like is radically underemphasized in its presentation to Western audiences. I'm not sure how much of that has to do with this kind of like overcompensation of sort of competing as a quote unquote alternative in a land whose like normative religious modalities are based on the very sort of passive, feminine, lunar telluric practices of faith and submission and prayer and things like that, right? So it's like, in order to make Buddhism different, distinct in this sort of market, right? It's presented as almost like a technology, as like, everything but something based around faith, right? And I'm guilty of this, right? Even though I can sort of rationally say these words, I wouldn't use the word faith in the first 50 words that come out of my mouth when I describe my practice, and that's kind of bizarre, right? Like, do you think that's something that will course correct with time, or I don't know, just anything more you want to say about that for Buddhism in the West?
So, yeah, I do have some things to say about that. First of all, faith in Buddhism could be, you can translate it as confidence, right? So that is interesting, an interesting way to think about faith, about how confident are you in the three jewels? Like, how confident are you in the path that you're walking? How confident are you in your teacher or in your practice? So that's a kind of faith. And I think to your point, I think what's arising is there's been a very strong emphasis in the West on blind faith, which is like faith without, like, you can't see it, but you must have faith in lieu of seeing it or experiencing it. Whereas in Buddhism, faith, I take it to mean quite a bit of a different meaning. And so it means more along the lines of like, are you confident in the path that you're walking and what it will attain? And then eventually, like, I'm thinking about the 3 levels of faith. I actually have Words of My Perfect Teacher here by Patrul. It's a famous, very famous sort of practice manual on the preliminary practices within Nyingma tradition, but it's used in lots of different traditions. And he talks about like these 3 kinds of faith. The first is like a vivid or a clear faith. And it's when you feel that clarity or joy or inspiration from actually encountering the objects of faith, namely like the Buddha, Dharma, Sangha. But then he goes through and it's like, the next one is aspiring. And then the last one is like confident or trusting faith. And that actually means I'm experiencing the thing, right? So it's like, how confident are you that sugar is sweet? Well, before you taste sugar, you're kind of confident because people tell you. And then you're sort of like, I think I would like to taste that sugar too. I'm pretty confident in it. I want to go for it. I want to try it. I may have to go a long way to get it or whatever. But then once you taste the sugar, that kind of faith, it's sort of unshakable because you've experienced the thing. And so that's the nature of, I think, faith within Buddha Dharma, at least in my traditions specifically. It's like, ultimately, faith is a tool. The faith, as we typically talk about it in normative Western society, is a tool to get to the experience of the thing. And then you have a different kind of faith that even doesn't really translate to faith. It really more translates to like confident experience. And in the Dzogchen tradition, they talk a lot about, once you have an experience of the nature of mind to a certain degree, like you could have a million gods show up in your bedroom and be like, you're totally wrong. And there's nothing that could shake you because they can't shake you. Just like you can't tell me, I could have a liner on the block telling me that sugar is not sweet. And I would think they're the dumbest people ever because I know sugar is sweet. Like I have that level of faith or that confidence. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think what's missing, particularly in the really, really austere, like I'll say the Dzogchen that I practice, that's again sort of decontextualized from the broader practice of Vajrayana with deity practice specifically. Maybe Zen is a little bit like this too, but I don't know. It's not my path. Is that everything is so sort of like, I don't want to say internal, but everything is focused on nature of mind, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so on the one hand, I sort of like walk around with this like sense of smug superiority, right? Because it's like I've seen it. Like I can sit down, I can do my little squat and look at the sky, and then like I could see like I don't have to believe in like Jesus or whatever, like I'm built different, but at the same time, right, like if I got word that my folks just were killed in a horrible car crash or whatever, right, there's sort of like nothing outside of my own experience to lean on. And now part of that is like, well, if I was sort of where I'm going and where I need to be, that wouldn't faze me at all. But this is sort of like an alchemical process that takes time. Even if you've had those like tastes, those sort of like direct experiences that fill one with such joy and confidence and relief, right? Like those are great words, but those things aren't binary, and I'm definitely of the like 3 levels of aptitude. I'm like the 4th. I'm like retard aptitude, right? Like I shouldn't even be in the room. I just wandered in and no one had the the guts to kick me out. Sure. Right? So like these are things that are going to like, this is a transformation that's going to go on for years of my life, right? At best, that would be great, 1 lifetime, but even still, that's decades potentially of my life, right? Yeah. And so in the meantime, without the kind of like emotional, provisional, all those squishy human things that we're trying to go beyond and that we're so proud of going beyond and not needing, turns out those things have a way of intruding back into our actual experience, even if we don't like to talk about it as rugged and austere Dzogchenpas or whatever. I don't know. I just it's an interesting I don't want to say imbalance, but it's a definite skew, that I've noticed, at least in my little circles, and for me personally.
Yeah, so very well said. I would make the assertion that those are signs of being still very new to the path relative to what is ahead. And there's always infinite things ahead in some ways. The people that really practice for a long period of time, that have some stability, they tend to have your realization or your experience, your stability within the experience can carry you forward, even if that is just defaulting to sort of previous levels that are not necessarily. So like, for instance, if there's some disaster and you can't rest in the nature of mind, you're too upset, bare minimum, you can say some mani mantras, or you can do a sadhana, or you can at least have some compassion, or you can, get down to bare bones. Like there have been times when it's like, I'm literally practicing mindfulness, like first step of like just breathing. And that's okay, right? That's an okay thing. But what tends to happen if you do the practice in a way that is authentic under a teacher, or at least far enough under a teacher to where you can sort of be self-propelled to a certain degree, you tend to be more humble around it and not less, right? You tend to be more open and not less. Now, of course, there's some exceptions to this, like famous lamas that I know, but the teachers that I know, they tend to be very humble and open to lots of different experiences in lots of different ways, and not nearly as dogmatic as their Western students. Like it's almost a joke among more advanced, more practitioners that have been around a long time. Like the students around the Lama tend to be far more dogmatic than the Lama tends to be. Which again goes to, I think, Jin's earlier point before we got interrupted by the dog, that it was there. People that think, okay, it's like Lamrim and it's very like Dzogchen is this, or, the tantric path is this, or, even like the colors of the chakras are this, right? Actually, what they're telling me is they have not studied enough, right? It's simple as that. Like for anything that you say on the path, I can give you something that's very different than that. And then you're left with like, oh gosh, which one? It's emphasized within it. Right. So like let's take the colors of the chakras, for instance. There are plenty of tantras that talk about different colors of the chakras than what is typical even within Tibetan Buddhism. Right. And that's within the tradition, let alone like commentaries that'll say, actually do it this way, or we found to do it that way. So people that get rigid around like, this is the path and these are the steps and all of that, they tend to be fairly not as developed as they probably could be in just their academic learning. It's through no fault of their own. I mean, people like, I've had the benefit of being semi-professional around this for many, many years. And it takes a long time with something like Buddhism that's so vast. But I would caution people just to think like everything that you think of like, this is the thing, there's lots of other versions of this is the thing, and they're not mutually incompatible, right? And I'll give you an example of this. Like, it's very common for most people to say like, oh, like what makes a lama? How do you become a lama? Well, you become a lama through a 3-year retreat. And I hear that all the time. I see it on Twitter all the time. Well, he didn't do a 3-year retreat, he's not a lama. That's actually not true. That's not true in the slightest bit. Like some of my teachers are Nakpas that have never done a 3-year retreat. They've done maybe a 49-day retreat or a 1-year retreat, or who knows what kind of other retreats. There are people that are hereditary lamas that are given like tulku, and they never did, or will do a 3-year retreat. There's lots of examples of this. So you don't need to be necessarily have a 3-year retreat, which came out of the Kagyu tradition as a way to kind of codify what they were doing, which is a step toward kind of the Gelugpa codification, especially around monasticism. And it's a great way to think. And it's not inaccurate, but held rigidly, that's just not the case, right? And so I think as you progress along the path, or as you at least get older, maybe it's not even the path, maybe I'm just speaking from old age, like you start to realize that, yeah, actually, it's not this way at all. There's lots of different exceptions to rules, or completely different rules that you also don't need to cling to. All of it is all just in service of upaya, which is skillful means to get you to the realization of your nature of mind.
I just want to say, and because I'm sure Jin's back by now. So for the audience, that little discussion about the colors of chakras. So that was the real thing that happened, right? I didn't know who to ask, and it was Tiger. I'm seeing these sort of these rainbow spheres, but the rainbows are wrong. The colors are in the wrong order, and what's going on? Am I doing something wrong? And I basically got a slightly expanded version of that answer, which is all to say that I hope that all you lovely audience members listening are able to, if you haven't already, connected with a Dharma friend. Like, I'm not saying Tiger, you can't have him, he's mine, but someone else in your Sangha or whatever, to be able to take those questions to that you can't always necessarily bother your Lama with or whatever, but to just get that, both the context, as well as like legitimately interesting and helpful information, but also that like reassurance, that like, don't freak out. Like, the rainbows are fine, you're fine, just like keep going, carry on. You know what I mean? Like that it's, I can't begin to tell you how grateful I am for that specifically, but just in general, like how essential that feels,
Yeah. Oh, that's awesome, man. Thank you. It's my pleasure to help in any way I can. Not to say that I know all the answers, but definitely like I think about it too. I had the benefit of having a really close Western mentor who was, a practitioner for 40 plus years. And he never had the title of Lama. He was he taught in lots of different ways, but he's also academic mentor. And he was that for me. And you're right. It is like, it's also important to have a close Lama too. Like if you can, a lot of people, I have this too. It's like, yeah, I have the jet set Lama, I lovingly call him, and he's all over, like maybe your Lama is, Saki Truzen or somebody like that. And it's like, yes, absolutely take empowerments, take his teachings, follow his stuff, all of that. But also like have somebody kind of local or somebody that you can like literally call or get on a Zoom call with that'll take your call. It doesn't have to be, it could be a Lama. It could be just somebody within the Sangha that you think has a taste of it. And it's really interesting because I've been around long enough now to where I can point to Westerners that embody this, that are either professional or semi-professional Dharma practitioners that really have attained some level of stability greater than mine, right? That I would go to. Even on, Twitter, there's a couple of people that I really respect that I'm like, yeah, I would ask advice from them for sure.
Well, you guys, great job, Solar. So you guys pretty much took all my interesting questions about the difference of colors in the Kalacakra mandala. But I think the chakra sort of allegory is even more fruitful. So we won't go there, I guess. But I actually did have something to build off, which was the nature of American Dharma. Now, this is something I've spoken with as many Dharma bros as I've been able to sort of wrangle to come on the show. But some of them are very pessimistic, and some of them are very sort of like they can't see it. Like the marga is just their marga. Like they don't have like a sort of an appraisal of the overall cartography. Me, I tend to take a very positive view because obviously I did live in Asia for a little bit. I have gone to Nepal. That's a very interesting sort of parallel that we have, as well as art history. And like Nepal was such a formative experience for me as well. Mm-hmm. And I just wonder, like, I feel like because Dharma is very dynamic in Asia, and like you were saying, like, yeah, most people practice Pure Land, but all the flavors are there. Mm-hmm. Like this is the same, like you go to Singapore, Malaysia, even Indonesia, there's a lot of these like jet set lamas, a lot. Mm-hmm. They all live in Singapore. They all like spend a lot of time there anyway. And they do give out a lot of empowerments. They've really opened the mandalas up in a way that is very radically perhaps different than even like 50 years ago. Mm-hmm. So you have like very normie people walking around with like Vajravega or like, some other rare deity, rare, Iram. So, mm-hmm. I mean, what I'm trying to say is that I take the idea that the sparks or the seeds of Dharma are already here in whatever form, maybe unripened, maybe rough, maybe the gems are, unpolished as they are or as they were, but there is something here and there is something that is actually beginning to take root. But I want to know what you think, obviously. I apologize.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree. And so there's a couple things going on. So it's like, how would we measure the success of the Dharma being transmitted to the US? And one way is okay, how many enlightened people, how many enlightened Westerners are there, or that have stepped onto, you know, the first Bodhisattva Bhumi, or whatever metric you want to talk about. And then like from an ethical standpoint, how much has Dharma ethics influenced or penetrated or united with ethics in the West? And then a third piece would be like, well, how much have the practices, in even a watered down way, and by watered down, I mean the practices themselves kind of filtering into everyday life and all of that. That's an interesting question too. And I go back to Bob Thurman had a book called Cool Revolution. And I'm not necessarily a huge fan of Bob's stuff, like very different tradition. And he definitely has some interesting choices around translation. But of course, like I lovingly have to defer to him because he's like the first real Western Buddhist scholar. I was also a practitioner, and at least in Tibetan Buddhism, rather. He talks about Cool Revolution. I think there's a Lama in there that has a vision, or maybe it's a different book. And the vision is essentially like there's a giant red stupa. And in the red stupa, it's like it's being eroded. And the red stupa is flowing into a river, but it's turning the river red. And this Lama took it as a sign that like, yeah, actually the Dharma in Tibet will be eroded, but it's going to actually benefit countless little beings that are in the river. And so from going like from top to or from bottom to top, rather, in my world, everybody knows what a chakra is, although they pronounce it chakra, which is totally fine. Everybody knows what nirvana is. You know, they have no real concept of it, but neither do most Buddhists, right? Everybody knows what mindfulness is and what breathing and all of that stuff. So that's all coming from Dharmic traditions writ large. So not necessarily just, you know, the Buddhist tradition, but other elements of Dharma too. And that's all, you know, filtering down into society, into modern, I'll just use American society, if we can say Western society. Then on top of that, you have people that are earnestly practicing, right? They're more earnestly practicing Western Buddhists right now than there ever have been, like period. And there will be more next year than there have been this year. And more people are coming on. Like my own kids would be considered like second generation Buddhists, right? That's a somewhat new thing to happen. And so that automatically is, you know, Dharma rising in the West. Now, if you go to like, what I think most people look at is they look at the austere measurements of like what counts as a religious professional. Like, how many pure monks are there, or how many pure practitioners are there? But even in Tibet or Nepal, it's like, well, if you really spend time there, I've been to Tibet, you know, a dozen times. Spent literal years in Nepal. To find a quote unquote pure practitioner that would live up to these people's expectations would be very rare, even by those standards, even by you know, Western standards or Asian standards. So that's just this like fanciful projection of that it will probably never be attainable. Now that said, I personally know many Western practitioners that have some degree of attainment, whatever that is, you know, even if it's just like a solid attainment of bodhicitta. That in and of itself is a massive jump on the path, right? Let alone like the nature of mind and all these pretty professional people that are in retreat. You know, there's 3-year retreats all over the place, you know, and dark retreats and all of that. So all of that to say, I am very, very optimistic about the Dharma in the West for lots of different reasons. So I'm only optimistic about it.
No, thank you so much for saying that. I appreciate that. I 100% agree with you about the sort of nature of quote unquote Asian Dharma teachers, although we live in a globalized world, and you know, so a lot of Dharma centers have a lot of money. And so you know, there's no such thing as an Asian quote unquote Dharma teacher anymore, that they're jet set, like you said. Well, some of them anyway. And then like some of them are more like humble and local. And then that's fine too. And like everybody is like out there cultivating Dharma, hopefully in the broader discussion of what that is.
Exactly. I think that's exactly right.
Okay, so I am going to ask to sort of end off. We'll discuss a little of something that I know is more specific to Twitter, like older Twitter, maybe like when you were more active, Tiger, but something that I often got into trouble for engaging with, which is not because I was particularly doing syncretism, but because I would come into conflict with people who were, I felt at that time, were sort of syncretizing in a way that I didn't necessarily recognize or understand. maybe I'll put it on myself and my own perception rather than like their own. But I am interested and perhaps curious of what you would say about like this neo-pagan or like pagan dharma, or like this like Vedic, although to me that's very contradictory as a tantric, but Vedic X dharma, or these various sort of configurations of we'll call it neo-American dharma, maybe asterisk or maybe question mark. But I'm not excluding it. I'm not excluding it either. I'm asking from a place of sincere inquiry.
So help me understand the question better. It's like the syncretic view.
Okay, so like the Odin things, like the Wotan stuff, like the kind of like movement to like a very Indo-European understanding of cosmology, and sort of like practicing Tantra, but not practicing Tantra I'm not saying that they didn't receive empowerments or however that looks like, or even their view is wrong, but sort of like the amalgamation of these things that are sort of, as you know, Tiger, like a lot of this has been sort of resolved. It's like there's a tantric logic that resolves all this. Like I would see it as unnecessary, but obviously I'm looking for you to sort of give me a framework or guidance on like how to view this topic.
Yeah.
And just can I just like, as a little addendum to that, there's like two simultaneous movements that seem to go in different directions, or apparently different directions. So one is this impulse to take everything back to a sort of like hypothesized like primordial state, right? Like the sort of proto-Aryan dharma, in a way that sort of privileges the Hyperborean Satya Yuga dharma over anything that quote unquote actually exists in historical time or living lineage, while at the same time elevating a sort of ethnicized, Europeanized flavor to it, right? Like, oh, we're going to practice the Hyperborean dharma as understood by, like, the Hitler Wotan Tantra or whatever. I'm being hyperbolic, but you know what I'm saying, right?
Sir, I'd like to read your Tantra. That's a great, so I think I have it now. So gosh, I think I have a simple and clean answer for you, Jin, but as with anything, I want to give some context for sure before I get to like the what I think of as my answer for that. There's two right now. There's like a Reconstructionist pagan movement in the West, Europe, and in America, and that is not yet fully formed. Right? It's sort of, like I said, it's Reconstructionist. Whereas if you look at Buddhism, how it entered into Cambodia, let's say, or Japan, for instance, in even Tibet, with the Bonpo tradition, in every culture that I'm aware of, it encounters both essentially like local nature spirits and also some kind of cosmology around higher level gods. And Buddhism's answer to this is always the same, whether it's Tantra or not. Tantra does it even more specifically and I think more clearly, but the answer is the same. The answer is like, yeah, those things, those forces, those spirits, those nature gods, those even celestial level gods, they all exist and they're all great, and you can continue to worship them, and you should. And if you want to understand the nature of mind, and I'm using that term, the Dzogchen terminology, but whatever it is, Buddha nature or whatever, if you want that, here's the path to do that. And along the way, you can interface with these gods or these spirits in ways that are maybe even more fruitful, right? We can teach you different ways to engage in them. And maybe you shouldn't like kill goats for them, but you sure as heck can like offer some milk for them, or like give them some wine or whatever. That's literally universal. So you see that in Thailand, you see it in Japan, you see it in all of Southeast Asia, you see it in Tibet, you see it in Mongolia very strongly. And so from that perspective, Buddhism and Tantra is completely compatible with any kind of externalized, it's essentially like a cosmology, but it also is, that may sound dismissive because it's also like practices and having to do with like nature spirits. I mean, I myself I'll do practices, like let's say there's something in Tibet called a song practice, like a smoke offering practice. And
Riwo Sangcho.
Yeah, exactly. Riwo Sangcho, the mountain smoke offering. That's what that translates to. Riwo is mountain. And you you offer to the deities first, to the Buddhas first, but then you literally call in, depending on the text you're using, all the local nature spirits, all the way down to the ones that I don't even know their names. There's tons of them, like 1 million of them. So none of it is incompatible with people that want to make offerings to Odin or make offerings to Thor or to whomever. Now, that's a little bit different. So that's my answer to that. Completely compatible. And maybe those guys are reconstructing, or maybe it's reconstructing in an authentic way that brings in things that are actually real. It doesn't really matter. Like, if you want to include that, fine. The main thing, though, is the path that leads to your own Buddha nature, which is clearly Dharma. Now, the flip side, though, is kind of what Solar was talking about, which is like, okay, is this proto-Indo-European, Aryan Dharma coming forward? You can make the argument that thread does absolutely exist, but it probably is not going to do anybody any favors to go back and try to reconstruct a path that's so intricate and so effective already, because you miss losing something in translation. Now, if somebody wants to attain enlightenment and kind of find the Terma, the treasure text of the ancient Hyperborean Tantra or whatever, that's totally fine. And I'm not going to dismiss that or say that's not a real thing, because pure vision exists. Like, I myself practice pure vision teachings, meaning a teaching that came in a vision to one of my teachers, right? So it's like, there's no lineage there. It's not like Buddha taught that in an unbroken lineage. That's very, very common, because there's an idea that once you're plugged into the divineness of all things, that you do have access to these things that would be considered just new teachings, essentially. So I would be very cautious about that, but I would remain open-minded to it under the right circumstances.
For the record, I do believe that is what you said is very close to, obviously it's not primordial truth, but it's very close. It's relative, right? But I think that there is like a primordial system. But I agree. This is sort of my impulse to practice Mahayoga. I'm just gonna, talk to the sky wives, develop my Vajra body, and worry about my own Marga. And cultivate bodhicitta along the way. I'm not, my thing is not to be either traditional necessarily or a reconstructionist. But I'm so glad you did bring up and address, I know I overcomplicated it, but the question about paganism and sort of the currents that exist in Western religion as it is. But I totally agree with you. But I do think that because I'm not even singling them out like Wotan or Odin people or any of that, but I do think that there is a kind of misunderstanding when it comes to, and you did address it, to red offerings. And I think that this is really fundamental, and it's because of the sort of reverence for the quote unquote Vedic texts and what those, their ritual shastras. I think that the difference is so fundamental, primordial from the tantric perspective. Like it says, we are reconstituting the words, the bijas. We are changing the fuck ups of sorry to use plain spoken language, but we are reconstituting the bijas of the Vedas, specifically because they did those practices and mixed, they sort of complicated and confused the system. So we have to kind of, when you offer do fire homa or whatever, you offer the substances, but the substance is also the mnemonic device for the bija. So you're sort of liberating the sound back into space. So for me, this is how I've always thought of it, is you don't want to return to those practices, because the whole point of it, especially for Tantra, is to sort of allow those words to be free in space, like wisdom, or access the Dharma stream. Obviously, that's the greater point. But you can also say that it's like a ritual methodology to liberate the actual Buddhist Sanskrit, to make it the path more clear, more concise.
Yeah. So you're saying that it's already been done, essentially,
Correct.
The internalizing of it. Yeah, I would add on to that and say, even in the Upanishad, I would say the entire Upanishadic movement, which you could make an argument that Buddha Shakyamuni came from that sort of milieu.
I agree with that.
Yeah, and many people don't read the Upanishads these days, but the entirety of the Upanishad movement is just taking the external ritualized texts and turning them internally. And interestingly, they don't say it's a new development. They say like, this is how it always has been meant to be. It's just that it was taught from an external perspective because most people are just out doing sacrifices, right? And that's what they're doing. So I would say that it's already, certainly, there's no need for sacrifices in that regard, right? In the regard of like, let's kill a bunch of animals. And I think that Buddhism is very skillful in taking those pieces and saying like, let's reframe this in a way that's that everybody's satisfied, that the deities are satisfied and that you're satisfied, and we're not like out killing a bunch of goats or whatever.
No, I totally agree, obviously. And I think it's really important to sort of, I guess maybe this is a Jin thing or just like a me thing is that I see it as a kind of, I'm just consider myself an axialist. So like I'm just moving forward with whatever the Kalpa or the Aeon is. So I don't even seek for myself. I don't seek a return. But I do seek to recognize my own like Buddha nature, and also, of course, be tapped into the Dharma stream, as you were talking about, like a pure vision. So maybe this will be my kind of like final question for me. Obviously, Solar can ask any follow-up he wants or about anything, but the sort of Reformation in the 1700s, whether you want to consider that like how they compiled like Longchen Integ or even Tsongkhapa's more generalizing but also totalizing reforms. A lot of the tantric texts, especially the ones that we have in translation, or at least in sadhana booklets, like maybe not the root tantra, of course, which are almost always Indian for the most part in origin, but the sort of sadhana practice texts, a lot of them actually come from this sort of Reformation and also re-encyclicalization of the 1700s.
Yes, that's true.
So it's very much like even Tantra has reconstituted itself. That's why I've always been primarily focused on like the Choseth Yogini cults, which obviously culminates in the Yogini Tantras, Buddhist and Indian both. And I more look at the synthesis and syncretism. That's more of interest to me rather than a return to like some kind of like, we was Kang's primordial past. That's just me.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you see that too. It's very interesting. I want to say it's a uniquely Western, but it's not just a Western impulse of like, let's get back to the original, the real. You see that sort of in early scholarship, which was in American scholarship, which was like, oh, the real stuff is like Theravada Buddhism because Pali and it's older and all that. And it's like, well, it's not quite so simple as that, right? It's not like like competing years and all of that. It's like what counts as original and pure is not always so obvious. And it doesn't even necessarily mean like the original. But there was definitely, I mean, the big thing, I don't know if you know this, but like Vajrasattva was considered among Tibetans that were not Nyingma for the most part. It was thought to be like a Tibetan invention. And it wasn't until Sakya Trizin, I believe it's him, pretty early on, like in the 1700s, maybe even 1600s, went and found a copy of it in Sanskrit from Nepal. And then everybody was like, oh yeah, this is the bomb. Like, this is fantastic. And it's like legit. And so that's why you see Vajrasattva in every single lineage, because it's like, oh, the thing that you thought was a Tibetan invention actually came from Sanskrit, from this great scholar that rediscovered it. So there is that notion in Tibet of like, let's make sure that we have lineage with it. And that's very true in every single lineage. And there are some lineages that are more focused on, well, let's get the essence as opposed to just the words. And so that's where you get like things like Terma, things like pure vision is much more prevalent within modern Nyingma than in other systems, because there's this idea of like, it's transmitting the nature of mind. And we don't really, like Buddha Vachana, the speech of Buddha, this enlightened speech shows up as anything if you're ready for it. It could be a baby's cry, it could be the wind through the trees, but you have to have the ears to hear it.
Yeah, absolutely. And for the record, Vajrasattva is an amazing practice. I guess I said that was my last question, but I thought, well, since you brought up Vajrasattva, I think it's interesting that like the text I'm practicing, it is relational, right? Because Vajrasattva is considered the emanating deity. And in the text, the primary deity is called Akalavira. So when I was in university, they didn't even teach us this distinction when I took Sanskrit between Akalavira and Ekavira. And it does have to do with Tibetan numerology and tantric number magic, and we won't get into that. But I do think that there is a kind of, I'm not going to say perennialist, but axialist idea of the Kumara, the Vajra Kumara, of like how he kind of reappears, like you were saying, like the Sakya trees. And I do believe that you were correct in saying that. So he kind of rediscovered the text. And of course, Nepal being that sort of repository in the material world of like, quote unquote, the Akashic records. Like this is not a new idea, but it is also proven out in Buddhist, like in tantric terms. Like everything survives in Nepal, and like the Nepali archives are full of tantras that have probably never even been described.
Yes. And there are, I mean, if we really want to take an emic, like an inside Dharma perspective, there are literally infinite tantras just waiting to be discovered that are from eons ago. And many of the tantras, they will claim, this is from a previous era. This is the traditional story about Vajrasattva, just using that as an example, it was like a rediscovery on Mount Malaya by Padmasambhava of like a very powerful tool or technique or system of practices that went back even beyond that era, beyond this current era of modern times. So yeah, you can make the strong argument, certainly from an inside Dharma perspective, like, yes, there are infinite tantras, and it's foolish to try to limit them with our ordinary minds, and that they do harken back to, I don't want to use the term archetypes, but they exist in a, like you said, an axial or perennial kind of fashion. Definitely.
Awesome. So you're saying I'm right about everything, basically.
100%. That was a foregone conclusion.
Well, thank you so much for coming on. I really appreciate it. I'm going to cede the mic to Solar if he has a last question or last word. And I just want to say
I think we're in a good place. We're in a good place, man. This has been a blast. Thank you so much.
Awesome. So thank you so much, Tiger. Again, obviously, if you want to plug your Twitter, you're more than welcome to. I'll include it obviously on the show card or title card. But if you have anything you want to plug, you're welcome to do that as well. But I just want to say, like, of course, I echo everything you said because you are like a senior Dharma brother to me. But I have to say, like, I feel like my path is like a little more. There's a little more maybe moonlight at least upon it, because I, got to hear at least reify my ego at least. A lot of the perceptions that I've at least been coming to, or maybe have had for a long time, but maybe both, have sort of been, I don't know. I there's a parallel. I feel like I'm not so far on a crooked path anymore. Maybe I never really felt like that, but sometimes your perception of the view changes. So thank you so much from a sincere place.
Oh, it's my pleasure. And yeah, I'm always happy to connect with both of you, and just really appreciate the opportunity to chat. It's so nice to talk to people that are very intelligent, sincerely practicing the path. So I really enjoy it. And yeah, feel free to, anybody can follow me listening. Twitter is just a place where I sometimes hang out, and I'm more than happy to chat, but I don't really promote anything or do much of it at all. But yeah, I would love to connect with people. And again, thank you so much, both of you. Really appreciate the time and just the conversation.
I mean, you're always welcome back. Just like throwing it out there. I always say it at the end, or try to, if I obviously like the person. But yeah, please come back if you want to. The threshold's always open.
Yeah, that would be fun. Let's do it again.
Okay, awesome. Thank you so much.
Cool. All right.